So tonight's talk is part of our exhibition, The Normal. And this is a response to the pandemic that we've all been living through over the last year and more. It's a group exhibition featuring 12 artists and duos, and it runs until the 29th of August. So if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, there's still time to call in and visit the exhibition. As with all of our exhibitions, all of our group shows, it aims to offer a set of diverse perspectives on things that are really affecting us today. So in this case, it covers the human, viral and ecological implications of COVID-19. And tonight with Femke, we're going to go deeper into the long relationship between people and pandemics and the surprising way this relationship links to capitalism. Femke investigates the ways that financial technologies impact upon material realities, geographies, value systems, histories, and individual lives. Within her practice, extensive research into this subject becomes the basis for mixed media installations that include the conception of new characters, stories, objects, sculptures, and sounds. Corrupted Air, and I'll read the full title here, Corrupted Air, IBRD CAR 111112. The work featuring in The Normal relates to Femke's recent focus on catastrophes and the financialization of the future. Specifically, this work tells the story of the bubonic plague and the way it kind of co-evolved with economic contracts like early insurance bonds. So in broad terms, this work is really about the way that the financial winners and losers of the future are already determined. Femke has exhibited internationally, appearing recently in the Gwangju Biennale in South Korea, the Taipei Biennale in Taiwan, CBK Zuidoost in Amsterdam, and Gropiusbau in Berlin. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to Femke, and I'll see you at the end for questions. Femke, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's very nice to speak to you again also about the work. It's always a little bit strange to be in these Zoom talks that you don't really know who's on the other side, but just to say, I'm here in Amsterdam on the kitchen table in between pots and pans and moving boxes. It would be nice to go a little bit more in detail about the work, Corrupted Air, with a long, detailed, how do you say, code behind it that James does pronounce really well. And I made this work in 2018, so it's actually, it's not that recent on the one hand, but it is a work that kicked off a whole long-term research project that I'm still working on. So it is actually nice to revisit it and to also explain you a bit the research behind it. And I'm gonna share my screen with you now. Yeah, oh, I have to, sorry. Yes. Okay, I'm just gonna show you a number of words, sentences in silence first. Yes, so these words, short sentences that you saw, they are from a financial prospectus supplement that was issued by the World Bank in 2017. This is a very big, large document of 386 pages. And this prospectus introduces what was at the time a revolutionary sort of step in financial risk management. And this product that this prospectus introduces is what is called a pandemic cat bond. So cat bonds is something that I've been working on from the last, I think, 3 years, researching them. And a cat bond is basically a financial instrument that models, predicts future catastrophes. These can be natural disasters, also man-made disasters, and these have been around since the mid-90s and are increasingly becoming more popular among investors because they are looking for ways to what is called diversify their portfolio. So to add things to the portfolio, investments that are not dependent on other financial movements or products, such as, for example, the oil price or stocks of companies. So this cat bond is really a kind of category on its own. And it's also quite interesting because, of course, when it follows a completely different logic, almost like the rhythm of planetary dynamics, like whenever an earthquake happens or a volcanic eruption, that is something that is very much on a different sort of rhythm and time scale than usually fluctuations in the market. So this cat bond has become a very popular product in the recent years and decade. And in 2017, the very first pandemic cat bond was issued by the World Bank. It is also important to say that most cat bonds are issued by insurance companies. They want to hedge themselves against the risk of a catastrophe happening because of, in a way, because of climate change. The number of what is called weather events has increased. So there is an increase of natural disasters, and insurance companies have problems with covering the risk, but especially also the claims whenever of their insurers whenever damage happens because of a disaster. And so what is quite special that in this case, maybe I should explain a bit in detail. So how it often works: insurance company issues this cat bond, investors buy, let's say, this cat bond, they invest money in it. If the kind of predicted catastrophe, which can be, I don't know, an earthquake in front of the coast of Greece, for example, if it happens according to circumstances that are described in, let's say, this cat bond contract, then the investor loses his money. The money goes to the insurance company, and the insurance company can use this money to pay out claims. If this natural disaster doesn't happen, the earthquake doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen under the right circumstances, it's too far out from the coast, or it's not strong enough, then the money is not released to the insurance company, but instead the investors receive a sort of monthly or annual, I think it's called a commission or a sort of interest on their investment. So these cat bonds have very different length, let's say. For example, during hurricane seasons, you have a lot of cat bonds that are only valid for 3 months, but there are also cat bonds that cover an earthquake in Japan that has a lifespan of 20 years, for example. So this is really roughly, let's say, how it works. And why this pandemic cat bond was a sort of innovative step, according to many, was because it was issued by the World Bank almost like a sort of humanitarian cat bond. So the idea was that this cat bond would protect the most vulnerable countries and communities around the world from the against the risk and from the damage of epidemics, pandemics. And so there is an extremely complicated underlying, let's say, process of modeling these potential future pandemics. And the idea was that the investors who would invest in this cat bond, that the moment a pandemic or an epidemic would happen, the money of the investors would become emergency funds to help the most vulnerable communities instantly. And the words that I showed you at the beginning are words that are coming from this financial prospectus that explains the cat bond in a lot of detail. And when I was researching this and going through it, what struck me was how much, let's say, our human body, not only human, but the body itself, the contact between human beings and non-human beings, our social contacts, even like, I think there's touch, there is bodily fluids, how these things are mentioned in the financial prospectus as forms of risk for pandemics. So the language that you come across while going through this prospectus is on the one hand very technical financial jargon, but on the other hand you have these very intimate human words. And I just wanted to show you this because for me it says, very strongly how our body and our social context is being financialized through an instrument like this. And just to show you here some, we don't have to really understand this, but I just wanted to show you, this is, for example, one table from the prospectus as well. And yeah, you see there's all this modeling in different grades of like, how many people have to die in order for the emergency funds to be released. The total amount of confirmed deaths has to be more or equal to da-da-da. And so here, for example, how the risk, it's also quite interesting, of course, the future, this future pandemic that they modeled in this bond in 2017 was based on former pandemics and epidemics. So that also kind of repeats certain patterns, as you can see here in the parts in the world that most at risk. Yeah, this is a kind of step, let's say, a way of how the emergency funds would be released in steps based according to the number of deaths and according to on which day it would happen. Here, another, this one that I don't really understand, but just to share it with you. And yeah, I think what is important to understand, for me, at least when I was working on this in 2017, 2018, I was quite sort of, on the one hand, how to say, I think I was sort of happy to see that there was a cat bond that was not protecting, let's say, private wealth and, houses around shorelines that could be destroyed around because of rising weather conditions, things like that, but that there was also a way of how the cat bond could be activated for more humanitarian purposes. And at the time I made this very simple work with it that I want to show you here. This is the installation view in Talbot Rice Gallery. The original one was more horizontal like this. And just to explain very briefly what you see here, this is a drawing from 1665 by Robert Hooke, who for the first time through a microscope looked at a flea and was drawing it also I thought what for me was interesting about this image is that at the time of the bubonic plague in Europe, the flea, first the rats, then the flea, was understood to be the host of the plague. Also, and I forgot to mention what was quite interesting about the cat bond is that besides kind of contemporary viruses, the plague was also mentioned as a risk, and which was for me interesting because I think somehow in my mind the plague was something of the past. So why is it mentioned as a risk in a cat bond issued in 2017? So I have these two images in the three light boxes. So first the flea that was for a long time believed to be the host of the bubonic plague. Now we know it's actually a bacteria that was modeled here 2015, sort of digital rendering. And in between these two images, there is very simply a sort of timeline that from very different sources tries to sort of create a speculative trajectory of the plague, the three big plague episodes in history. And what it mainly looks at is how the plague was spread through trading routes around the world. So the Silk Route, for example, but also traders that arrived from Crimea to Italy, and on boats, that's how the plague supposedly got into Europe. So I was interested in kind of this relation between the plague and trading, between disease and capitalism, and how this historically enhanced, let's say, each other, how it follows each other's path. And this sort of timeline ends with the cat bond in 2017 being issued, and how the plague is also indexed as a risk there. And just before I think I sent this away to print, there was an event in Madagascar where the plague broke out and killed 171 people. So I included that as well. Of course, you could continue this list because we know now that the plague is not extinct. It is often dormant. We can treat it, of course, in a much better way, but it still pops up here and there. And so this was a kind of sort of very simple way for me of trying to note down this relation between disease and trading, and from a very historical perspective, but also how it comes together in this new cat bond. Then let's see what is, yes, then, so this was all done in 2018, and then of course we arrive in March 2020, and this was very strange because it seemed in context of this work, because suddenly it seemed as if reality started to catch up with the work. I maybe have to mention that of all these cat bonds that have ever been issued, only a very, very small percentage has actually been triggered by a real event. So many of those cat bonds with their speculative catastrophes are just circulating in the markets, generating money, but like a sort of speculative future. But yeah, a few of them actually get triggered by real events. And this turned out to be a really, last year turned out to be a really bizarre case around this cat bond, because it was in a way, yeah, looking each day at the news to see, okay, does the cat bond do what it's supposed to do, what it promised to do? And you could say that the cat bond already failed in the previous years between 2017 and 2020 to fulfill its promise, because around the world in vulnerable communities, different epidemics, even pandemic, broke out, such as Ebola in the DRC or dengue fever in Latin America. Yet this cat bond was never triggered because not enough people had died, and so the emergency funds were never released. Instead, investors who put their money in this cat bond kept receiving interest. I think the actual number was that in the end, some of this cat bond, also because of Corona last year, was released, something around 31 million US dollars. But in the meantime, 75.5 million dollars was received by the investors that were just waiting and receiving money while the cat bond was not triggered, because it didn't fulfill the parametric trigger, the parametrics of the cat bond. And so it became almost the cynical thing where, yeah, investors started making money of emergency funds that were never released. While we all know pandemic is something that, you know, operates with extreme speed. And so it's all about releasing funds instantly. And so in communities, things, yeah, can be done, at least an attempt. And so, yeah, this was somehow the work last year. Yeah, initially when I made the work, it was a kind of trying to trace, let's say, this risk imaginary around this relation between a pandemic, disease, and capital. And then suddenly, yeah, last year, the work got activated through COVID again. So let's see, yeah, maybe, so this was, yeah, very small work was a kind of part of a bigger series and a bigger research that looks into how human lives are kind of financialized as risk. So on the one hand, how you know, a life can have worth within an insurance, like, let's say, world, and can be protected or not, can be at stake. And this, of course, always brings questions like, okay, which lives are supposed to be protected? Who has the means to protect his life? At the same time, it also questions how certain communities are, by the insurance industry, labeled as risky. And these communities actually don't have access to any means of insuring themselves or hedging themselves against risk, because they simply don't have access to these markets. And so I guess what is a bit the underlying, let's say, viewpoint is, yeah, how often we look at inequality through the distribution of wealth, but you know, you can also look at it, or that's at least what I'm doing here, how inequality in a society is created by the distribution of risk. On the one hand, yeah, who has the ability to fight off risk, but also who has the ability to take risk, because taking risks also is sometimes necessary in order to grow or to learn, or, you know, to maybe go to school that is a bit out of your way, or yeah, so this is a bit more the general underlying research throughout these years. I wanted to show you also this, the earlier work about the pandemic cat bond is part of this larger work. This is a double-sided light box, or yeah, sometimes there are as two light boxes on the wall. And basically what you see on one side is what I call the table of catastrophe bonds. So here I collected for a number of years all the cat bonds that have ever been issued by insurance companies and are circulating in capital markets. And the time frame is from mid-90s until 2018 when the work was made. So it's a sort of just a very simple index, but I think a very important one for me to make, to try to understand how also Wall Street kind of looks at our future as a catastrophe. And so, yeah, it was for me important to make this index and to simply show it as such. So this is the image that you see on the left, and on the right side, you see the table of casualties. Wait, can I show? So sorry, this is a detail of the table of catastrophe bonds. So you have the date when it's issued, the risk that is covered, also the amount of capital involved, and then the issuer. There's all sorts of categories like earthquakes, typhoons. You also have very complex, let's say, cat bonds that cover multi-catastrophe. So for example, an earthquake that also creates a tsunami, but that also creates damage in multiple countries. So these are extremely complex financial products, and the modeling behind it even more so. But then there's also categories like here at the top, you can almost, yeah, you can see a little bit. One category was extreme mortality, and it's not even mentioned due to what, but the category in itself is, I think, very scary. And so I just wanted to kind of have this out there. Then on the back side of the light box, there is this table that was made in 1662 by John Grant. We would call him now a researcher, probably. His sources were maybe still a bit doubtful in the way what science maybe is today, but he was in a way the first, or at least, let's say, it's always very complicated to claim something is the first, but what is known to be the first mortality table. So he kept track of the city of London throughout a number of decades, what people died of. So on the left side, you can see death causes. This is just a detail. And then the years, and just simply how many people died of this cause at the time. Yeah, it's quite interesting. You see also in the causes of that a lot of things that maybe now, are simply just a disease we can solve quite easily, but there's also things like fainted in a bath or King's Evil, which I first thought, oh, maybe, they were, they have fallen out of grace with the king, but it turned out that there's something apparently on the lungs. Well, anyway, I thought it was quite an interesting list, but mostly because I felt this was the very first sort of route that eventually led to cat bonds. And the way I can explain it is, if someone starts noting down what people die of in a specific area, you start to get a pattern. And when you have a pattern, a historical pattern, you can start also making a future pattern, a prediction. And 400 years later, we arrive at extremely complicated predictions, such as the cat bonds. And the insurance industry is using all this historical data of communities. What do people die of? What is risk in this community? Is there pollution? Are they getting sick from it? Is certain neighborhoods labeled as dangerous? Should we make the insurance more expensive in these neighborhoods? So all of this is really, a whole big data driven industry. And so I wanted to kind of juxtapose this overview of this cat bond, which in the financial world are called the high Olympics of finance, because they're one of the most complicated products out there. And juxtapose them with this kind of route, historical route. Let's see. Yeah, this is how it's sometimes also shown. Then maybe I just wanted to show you this as a kind of work that is a sort of in-between work, we could say, that shifted also the research into another direction. At this point, I had been, the year was actually 2019 of this work, Diving Reflex, because we learned not to drown, we can sing. At this time, I had already been working for 3 years on cat bonds and spending a lot of time in Excel sheets, looking at all these imagined modeled catastrophes. And I think it started to do at one point also something with your sort of mental state, you know, if it becomes your kind of filter to look through the world, it becomes a very sad, scary world. And so I started to think like, okay, what is there actually left to do when I'm sitting here with all these cat bond indexes? Like, what is there basically left to say about a future that has already been mapped, calculated, modeled, and even traded as a catastrophe? Because that's what is actually happening with these cat bonds. The future is traded as a catastrophe. And I thought like, okay, what is there left to say about this future, you know? And so I wanted to kind of find a sort of counter voice against this catastrophe. And I started researching more about catastrophe, and I found this interesting notion that in Greek theater, where the word catastrophe actually derives from, that a catastrophe is a moment in the play where events, things turn around, they take a sort of sudden turn. But this turn doesn't always have to be a negative turn. It can also be, it is in any case something that is unexpected. And I thought this could be an interesting plot device to try to think about this notion of catastrophe in a different way, not in this sort of discourse of doom, let's say, setting, but more as a sudden turn away from what we know. And so I started again from the cat bond data set that I've been building and collecting through the years. And this time I decided to make another lightbox, but a calendar with it. And so, yeah, on the right image, you see the whole calendar. So we start on the left in the mid-90s when the first cat bonds were issued. And I think it ends here something in 2040, and it runs even to the background. But what is quite interesting, I don't know if I have a full image where you can show it, maybe here on the right, is that you see in the middle, it's very busy with all the cat bonds. So each cat bond has a black, let's say, line that indicates the duration of this cat bond. So as I said before, some can be 3 months, other can be 20 years, and everything in between. So there are these lines, and then it's stated what is the risk, who issued it, and the amount, and also if it's triggered or not. And the kind of color surfaces you see from top to bottom are indicating the different sort of categories, you could say. So earthquakes, more water related disasters. There's also body related disasters that include very direct risks to human bodies, non-human bodies, etc. And I just wanted to see, okay, what if I put this on a timeline? Which kind of image of the future do I actually get? And I thought I was quite hopeful that a lot of the, let's say, cat bonds and the modeling behind it apparently cannot look much further than a certain point of time, because there we have more empty space again. And so I thought that that was also quite hopeful and interesting, that you know, there is a very limited way of looking at the future, and after that there is again sort of space also for imagination. And so this light box is part of a bigger installation. Here are some images. Here's some details from the, oh yeah, I forgot to mention something important in this particular case. I listed in this cat bond calendar all the cat bonds ever issued. But what happens when you look at this list is that you see very quickly that all the disasters that are covered by these cat bonds are mainly disasters in the West, because the insurance company is more active there, because there is more value to insure. And of course, the question arises, what happens to all the other disasters outside of the West? What happens to people who need emergency funds there, etc. And so I just made annotations on this cat bond calendar with actual natural disasters that didn't happen, so that are not speculative models for the future, but that did happen, also to kind of pinpoint this strong division, obviously, in this model present. It's not surprising, but I just want to mention it. And so, yeah, this installation is part of a sort of 12-channel sound piece where very simply explained, there are two characters. One is the character of the last man, that in a way is a character that is kind of obsessed for the first time in history with its own extinction, that realizes that there is a limitation to things, that his life, his environment could be at stake, and that very obsessively starts calculating, modeling, mapping everything. This character is the last man, and the cat bond is one of his tools. And in a way, yeah, I think it represents a lot of anxieties represented here in Europe, Northwest Europe, but also this thing of where maybe for the first time in history, this idea of existential threat is a sort of possibility, whereas many communities around the world have already kind of lived through the end of the world in their own way many times. So yeah, this last man represents that part. And opposite of him is not physically necessarily, but in the sound piece there is a character called Elaine, and she is a aquatic creature that is based on a theory by Elaine Morgan, a Welsh playwright, who, in a very short, if I explain it very shortly, she was a playwright who basically didn't agree with all the evolutionary theories around competition and aggressiveness, and was, as an amateur scientist, writing books on how care, nurture, children, friendship, things like that were important for evolution as well. And she has this beautiful hypothesis how, because of climate change, our very far ancestors who are forced to live more in close proximity to the shoreline rather than in the mainland, and how this kind of cohabitation with the water created certain physiological changes in our body. One is the diving reflex, after which the work is named. And the diving reflex is something we have in our body where whatever we do, when cold water hits our face, whether we dive in a swimming pool, we just pour it over ourselves, you automatically hold your breath, you take a big gulp of air to store more oxygen in your blood so you can survive the short moment without breathing. And according to her hypothesis, this sort of diving reflex would have evolved into a kind of controlled breathing that would allow for a very conscious way of humming, eventually singing, and much later to speech. And so in this work, I'm exploring to the sound piece how a catastrophe actually gave birth to a new voice. And so Elaine is this character that embodies this kind of proto-voice. She can't speak language or existing words, but makes sounds with her mouth. It comes from her larynx, and she becomes a kind of antidote to the last man. So her embodied knowledge by living through the catastrophe juxtaposes all the kind of calculated knowledge of the last man. yeah, here we can see some. On the right side is the larynx. It's a sound sculpture. The voice of feeling emits out of this. Yeah, there were various elements in the installation that were all used initially as instruments for the sound piece and that also emit the sound. I'm not sure how I'm doing with time, but I think it's maybe good to end here and see James again and see if there's any questions.
Hi, Femke. Thanks for that great talk.
Hi. I just want to show you the last project also to end on a slightly more hopeful note, since I know my work can at times be a bit, yeah, what's the word? Gloomy or something.
Well, I suppose that, I mean, maybe that relates, Femke, to some of the questions that we've got in about whether you found that all this research into these financial schemes, all this speculation has made you more cynical as an artist.
I mean, yes and no, I think, because I started, maybe just to explain, I started researching the financial world like 12 or 13 years ago when I just graduated as a graphic designer. That's actually my background. I think you can also see the bit in some of the works. I was invited to do residency in the financial district in Amsterdam and to do a project with my neighbors. And I was like, yeah, but okay, who are these neighbors? Because you just have glass towers. And I found out there's a lot of mailbox companies that are purely there to avoid taxes. And so I started indexing all these neighbors that I had and revealing this kind of, let's say, financial logic present in this neighborhood. And from that moment on, I each time figured out something new about this financial world. And once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. And then you, let's say, yeah, you see a door and you have to open it. And so at times I'm really amazed by, this is maybe not a popular thing to say, but that there are a lot of maybe commonalities with art in the sense of, you know, to imagine a future catastrophe in this sort of grand way and to completely map it in detail, you know, there is a huge amount of imagination, yes, and data also, but imagination necessary, or to create financial products around extinct species or when species will go extinct. And so there is this kind of leap of imagination that I think we as artists, you know, use as well, but it's used here, of course, for very different purposes. So there is always a bit this push and pull where you at times feel that there are certain tools, or let's say, yeah, even tools, because I think if you look at the dematerialization of money in the late 60s, early 70s, when money became disconnected from the gold standard and basically became, you know, could become sky high data that could go anywhere. You also have this, ideas in art around the dematerialization of the art object. And you see that finance and art start to use a lot of the same sort of even formal things like indexes, descriptions of things that are not actually there. And so I think there is a lot of, somehow, even if we want to or not, a lot of things that meet in this research for me. I try not to, of course, be cynical. I think I'm intrigued by it, and often it disturbs me so much that I have to keep working on it. But you need to, for example, I like now that all these cat bond indexes and calendars actually have become almost scripts for a counter script in the work. So in that sense, I think it is a way of trying to go beyond that initial sense of cynicism. Yeah.
As you were talking, I was thinking a lot about prediction tonight, because that's obviously a key sort of element in this work. And, you know, I think what you've revealed to us tonight is just this incredible extent of all this financial speculation into the future. And as you say, it's a a creative process, it's a rich process, it's multifaceted. But then when you look back to the start of the pandemics across the world, there was a real sense that a lot of governments were just kind of scratching their heads. They weren't prepared. There wasn't enough oxygen. You know, things were not put in place to try and help people. So I guess I'm asking about how we distinguish between different forms of prediction. It seems like there's something quite specific about what finance does that somehow governments weren't able to do in a very real world sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have been great if, you know, the cat bond would have also made predictions about those things, like really practically ventilators and, you know, but of course, you know, it doesn't go there, because I think what is finance, you know, why does finance get involved with something like this is because on the other end, there is also potentially money to make, you know, in a way, a cat bond is a sort of bet if something's going to happen or not. And so I think, you know, it is not a sort of humanitarian aid. It is something that some investor potentially should also be able to earn money from or profit from. And so, yeah, there is this, I think there is a level of abstraction that the cat bonds keep in place. You know, it is never about the actual help or how it materializes on the ground in that local condition or that, but it is always about a certain batch of emergency funds that then will be released, but then what actually happens to it is a bit up to, yeah. So, you know, I think the way how the cat bonds operate in these kind of private markets is very different than where the government predictions and models operate, I feel. I mean, you know, I'm not an expert, but if it was really the case that these would be overlapping, we would not be we would not see all these examples where nobody saw this coming, except the financial world.
Yeah, I guess there's a sort of disproportionate amount of investment in this, isn't there, in this kind of projection into the future. And if all those resources were made available to the public interest, it could have made a big amount of difference.
Yeah.
With the work that we're showing at Talbot Rice Gallery, I mean, there's a real sense that you're drawing out with this narrative of a very long history. And I think one of the ideas that people might take away with them is that somehow finance and disease and trade have always been kind of growing up hand in hand. But then I think there's also a sense that you may be pointing us towards something that feels quite new and quite distinct to the era that we're living through. Do you think these catastrophe bonds do represent some kind of significant change?
I mean, a change, yeah, a change in what? Maybe that's I would ask you, a change in, I mean, you know, I think sort of ways of predicting the future, you know, whether it's now through big data or whether it is through a medium, I don't know, or an oracle or something, that, you know, I think this is part of our humanness, you know, the urge to predict, you know, what lurks in the future, the thing we don't know, and how do we protect ourselves against this. But I think the amount of data that is now available through a lot of scientific instruments, through new technologies, I think that's a whole new ballgame in predicting these events. I mean, they're also so immensely complex that before it was kind of impossible, and now there are these technologies that I don't know, I mean, in a way, humanity is starting to use these technologies to make these predictions. But, you know, still we are surprised by many other things, and the predictions that we make are not accurate. That also shows in all the cat bonds that are not triggered. So in that sense, I think there is something new in, the means of prediction, but predicting itself is of course as old as we are. Does it answer your question? Or were you hinting at something else?
I suppose I was wondering if maybe somehow finance has become almost more intrusive in the kind of world we live in today. I guess I've been looking at Thomas Piketty's books on capitalism in the 21st century, and that there seems to be just this dramatic increase in people being able to get a return on their money. So if you're born into great wealth, the amount of money you can make back from that is far exceeding what people can make through hard work, through jobs, through salaries. It's moving much faster. The return on money is moving much faster than growth in education, in schools, in public investment, in jobs.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, I feel almost like some of these catastrophe bonds come from this quite new world of high speculation and financial gambling that have led to some of the recent crises that we've had. Financial crises.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, that's why, it's nicknamed, the cat bonds nickname of being the high Olympics of high finance, it affirms that, I would say. Yeah, I mean, there is this, in my work, I always say, like, I don't research the economy, but high finance, which is really the specific part of how money is made purely by circulating other capital or value. And I think it is quite stunning how each time new derivatives of derivatives of derivatives are being invented, and you can even make money of that. I think it's also, just to give a very simple example, when oil futures, the future, I'm using the word future here as a financial product, oil futures are being traded. It's not like real oil is being traded. You're trading that somewhere in the future, you could have oil for a certain price. But even when you have that future, it's not like someone will show up at your doorstep with oil. It's purely the real oil market, the real or physical oil, and the oil being traded in these financial markets. They're two completely separated things, and that is still, I think, very hard for us to imagine. That there is this kind of meta world hovering around our material, physical, real world, and that, the amount of value that moves there every day is so much more than is actually physically exists on Earth. And this is the whole point also with the disconnection from money, from the gold standard. Then it didn't have to be backed up anymore by something in the real world. And the consequences of this are, I think we cannot really imagine that. How, I mean, it's really scary if you think about what with all of these developments, how that will at one point really have to crash. Not just, a crisis here or there, but really, like, I mean, I'm obviously not an economist, but you just imagine that you can't endlessly keep doing that, connect money to a derivative, to a derivative, to a derivative.
I think you slightly touched upon an aspect of the work, and here I'm kind of referring back to the title of it being corrupted air, something that we breathe, something that's very bodily, that's all around us, that surrounds us. And I'm thinking as well, Femke, of the essay that you wrote of the same name. And you're writing about how these financial schemes, I'm just going to quote a line from the essay here, but you said, you're talking about how these financial schemes invade future bodies and social relations by modeling and pricing human touch, closeness, failing respiratory systems, damaged tissue, and exchanges between human and non-humans as financial risk. And I'm also, in my mind, I'm flashing through some of the words that you shared at the start of your presentation. I just wonder if you could say a bit more about this, almost like a tactile level to the way that these finances are impacting upon people.
I mean, I think, I don't know, I think at least when I started working on this whole sort of financial world, I always had the feeling it was something very far away, removed from me, things happening in Wall Street, on the stock exchanges. And then I think it was once a lecture I listened to from oh, I forgot her name. Oh dear, I can look it up later. Saskia, anyway, I can explain it. She explained how basically finance can invade every part of life through a little bridge called debt. She explained it like that. And, you know, this also says something very simple in a way, how, I don't know, even our student debt, for example, I still have a student debt, you know, young artists, like many others, I think how through the student debt you are tied into the financial markets. But also to think, for example, of yourself as an investment, like, oh, I take the student loan because it's investment for later. That is already a kind of financial concept that you internalize. So this is still on a more kind of mental level, but just to show you how I think it also invades the way we think about society, others, and ourselves. And then when you look at these cat bonds, indeed, and these this particular financial prospects, it's really scary of how, yeah, literally your body, you know, and me touching my neighbor is already mapped as a financial risk. And I think that is something that, yeah, with this work, I wanted to just simply, on the one hand, yeah, understand and show how it can penetrate every part of life. You know, like I maybe mentioned before, you know, there's financial products that are speculating on when the next species goes extinct. You know, these are very material things. It's not some abstract thing in a cloud or numbers on a screen. It really invades the tissue and your emotional relation with others, I think. Yeah.
I can see from one of the questions we've got, just acknowledge this from Peter, but there's a comment that capitalism isn't to blame for everything here. I don't quite know how to sort of phrase that in a sort of question form for you, Femke, but I guess, I mean, we are really cutting across like big swathes of history and time and economics through this project, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
no, yeah. I mean, I think I also always say, you know, the word capitalism, I always use finance or high finance. That's what I'm in. I think capitalism in itself is like, yeah, I mean, it's so big. I think a lot of people have maybe even different understanding of it, what it means. It's something very hard to relate to, I think. So I try to always be very specific in the things that I research, and, you know, to say, yeah, I'm against or capitalism. Yeah, I don't even know what a statement like that means or does these days. Yeah, so in that sense, I agree. But yeah, I saw there was another thing in the chat about the images, about the flea.
Yeah, I think people are interested, Femke, in you maybe just saying a little bit more about the form that the work takes, and you know, why does it take the form of light boxes? What led to you presenting the information and the research in these particular ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, in my practice, I have a lot of moments whenever I start with a new research that I create very kind of simple works that map out something and that then become a sort of starting point for other works or more complex installations or, yeah, writings, etc. And I think in this case, I was interested in just, creating this speculative trajectory, this timeline of this plague and its relation to trading. And on the other hand, I was interested in how our understanding and also depiction of a disease changes over time. So, you know, when a new let's say visual tool like the microscope emerged, there was suddenly the possibility of researching, you know, on a micro scale. So the rat was no longer the one that spread the plague, but then there was this possibility of the flea, and it was depicted in a lot of detail. And so that was the kind of, how do you say, the perpetrator for a long time. And then now we have kind of much more advanced instruments and scientific research, and it is possible to model this bacteria. So then there is this kind of new sort of visual placeholder that has to fulfill, this sort of image of this very complex disease and how it spreads. So I was interested in also how that changes over time. Our ways of depicting that in a single image. And the light books, I think we also once spoke about. It is something I have used more often in the work. I think for me, there is something of how it hovers between the screen, the screen full of data, full of the trader screen. I also made a lot of works around that, but it is a still image. So on the one hand, it has this kind of electronic sort of feel to it, like the lighted screen. And on the other hand, it's also used in, of course, hospitals, medical settings, the X-ray, to look at X-rays. So there's not a lot of complicated decisions behind it. It's quite straightforward, and that's how I also wanted to introduce this research at first.
Okay, I'll round this up very shortly, Femke. I guess while we've got you with us, I should really find out about that subtitle for the work at the gallery. So it's Corrupted Air, IBRD CAR 111112. What does the subtitle represent there?
It's basically the name of the cat bond, the code of the cat bond. Yeah. So maybe also in general to say this series of works around the cat bonds, it has all the title Corrupted Air, and of course it's on one hand literally about the air being corrupted by a virus, by microbes, but on the other hand also how it is corrupted by these financial instruments in a way. So
great. And I guess to sort of round this up, Femke, and given that so much of this work is about prediction into the future, I mean, do you feel you have a sense of the way that these things are starting to move, these financial schemes, or a sense of where this work might take you next, where the research is leading you?
Well, this work is almost from 4 years ago, so a lot happened in the meantime, but the cat bonds and the catastrophe is still an ongoing research, something that is still evolving, where new things are happening. So I'm working actually on a new specific cat bond at the moment. I did also other works in between, but this one just came out, and it again was quite mind-blowing in my opinion. So I think for a while I'm not being able to get rid of these cat bonds yet. And I think there's also something interesting in following this, also in discussion, obviously very much outside of art, but to see how this product evolves and what are the discussions around it. And so this is something I also think is interesting to do long term. So that's why it's something that always lingers a bit in the background and then here and there pops up again. Sorry, I can't be more specific, but yeah.
Is this a kind of under embargo at the moment, Femke? Is it a really crazy new catastrophe bond that we should all be worried about? But you can't tell us more.
No, I know. I think, I mean, if you go look into it yourself, but it's something that I'm still trying to figure out how to talk about it, and what my position is. So I think it is something quite, I don't know. It's not something like, oh my God, it's, how to say, these cat bonds always cover specific communities around the world. The pandemic is a global event, but usually these cat bonds are very around very specific geographies. And so in this case, it's about a specific geography, and it's also about, it's something quite removed from where I live. So it's also about finding a relation to that place, and what are you able to do with that and say about that, etc. Yeah.